So thank you for joining us today. My name's Theo. I'm the Centre Coordinator for ACAHAT, which is the Australian Centre for Architectural History, Urban and Cultural Heritage that is hosting this exhibition. I'd like to introduce Warren Anderson, who is a biographer on the studio of Ivan Ivanov, a Bulgarian-born Perth-based architect that operated in the post-war period. So today Warren will be giving a talk about the sort of genesis of his research into this exhibition, and also a publication that he's working on that will launch soon.
Yes.
So thank you, Warren.
Okay, thanks very much for turning up today. The studio of Ivanov is a comprehensive research into the works of Ivan Ivanov. Since his passing in 1986, there's been about a 30-year vacuum of speculation and misinformation and very little in-depth research into his work. So I took the opportunity to do this project, and we are now going to publish a book fairly shortly in the next couple of months. The name is normally spelt with a W, but the pronunciation, the German or Bulgarian pronunciation, is a V. So the correct pronunciation of his name is actually Ivan Ivanov, and most Australians call him Ivan Ivanov. But if I'll use the reference Ivan because I think it's a bit easier for myself. The background to this was I wanted to do a look at the influences of the cultural and academic influences of Ivanov in order to understand his works. So the first part of the research was actually to go to Munich Technische, where he was educated, and I was very fortunate that they actually had his student records in their archives. So it was useful to actually look at what he actually studied during that time. And most references to his works are that he's a brutalist or impressionistic. But if you do have a close look at how he was educated and what his actual approach is, he's more a classical, formal architect, and there's a duality in his work between modernism and classical forms of architecture and design. Ivanov was born in Vratsa, about 112 miles northeast of Sofia, which is the capital of Bulgaria. He grew up in an artistic family, and he was taught to draw and to do watercolours as a teenager and a child by Ilya Beshkov, who's one of Bulgaria's most renowned artists. Ilya actually has his own dedicated gallery in Bulgaria, and you can see very much the influence of Beshkov in Ivanov's work, because in terms of his sketching and his caricatures, and one of the features of Ivanov's works is that he used to do caricatures of the owners of the houses as a gift, and so almost like a cartoon of the owners, and that's one of the bonuses of dealing with him as an architect. Beshkov was a political cartoonist in Bulgaria, so he did a lot of satirical works about the Communist Party at the time, and you can see very clearly some of the influence on Ivanov's illustrations and drawings. Ivanov was educated at Munich Technische in Germany during the Second World War, from 1939 to 46. Hans Dolgast was his professor. And Hans saw very early on the talent that Ivanov had and took him under his wing and helped him work in his own private practice and mentored Ivan. When I had a look at the curriculum at the university, it was very evident that it was very much focused on classical architectural design, and also there was a lot of input in terms of construction and technical drawing. I was trying to find out whether or not at the time the Bauhaus influence was still around, because the National Socialist Party in Germany sort of banned or wound up the Bauhaus movement in about 1933, and when Ivanov was studying at Munich in 1938 to 46, it was quite evident from, if you look at this photograph, that there was an artistic component of the course in terms of sculpture and design, And although there was no overt reference to the Bauhaus movement and the principles, you can see that they did actually incorporate it into the course, probably very subtly. That's a picture of Ivan in about 1942. The person on the left there is Angel Dimitrov, who was a co-student at the university. And Angel immigrated to Australia and settled in Melbourne, and was very influential in Ivanov's life later on when he came here. This is a picture of a group of Bulgarians, and it was quite interesting because I thought that Ivanov might have been on his own there, but actually there was quite a large cohort of Bulgarians who actually were studying at the university at the time, and that included engineers and other professions. And a lot of these people that Ivanov was studying with came out to Australia, so that was an interesting link. And the picture on the left is Angel Dimitrov. After Ivanov graduated in 1946, he was fortunate enough to work on a project for the post-war reconstruction of Munich, because during the war the city was actually flattened, and there was a huge need for social housing at the time. And so Ivanov was working for the Office of the Government in doing apartment building construction, and there's a few apartment blocks there that are actually still existing in Munich, and they used a technique called slip-form concrete construction, where they built the central core and then they did a scaffolding around it and constructed each floor in stages. And this was a very useful background, because Ivanov had a trifecta of art as being an artist, being an architect, and also had a strong training in engineering. So after he emigrated to Australia, there was a great need in Australia, and particularly in Perth, for construction of low-cost social and other housing. So that experience in Munich was very useful. How Ivanov ended up in Perth was quite interesting, because his first choice was actually to go to America. He wanted to go to California, where all the modernist people were at the time, but unfortunately his first choice was America, the second choice was Argentina, would you believe, and then the third choice was Australia. And he ended up getting a ship to Australia with 2,300 other people, and they were all stacked up on the decks. It was huge, hugely packed and densely packed. So after 4 weeks of sitting on a ship from Naples to Australia, they were due to actually come to Melbourne. Ivanov was actually originally going to come to Melbourne, but because of the Korean War in 1950, when they immigrated, the ship was requisitioned, and what they did is they turfed all the people off in Fremantle and took the ship back to Korea. And so after 4 or 5 weeks on a boat, coming from a European winter to a Perth summer, I think they just wanted to be somewhere and just be stable and just wanted to settle down. If we have a look at Ivanov's works, it's split into 3 periods. One was a 1950 to 60 period, where predominantly Ivanov was designing houses which were in the convention of the modernist architects of the time, particularly the California influence of Neutra and others with the Skillion roofs and Frank Lloyd Wright. And the situation was, when Ivanov came to Australia, his degree or qualifications was not recognised by the Institute, and he was working for a firm in Perth called Crampton Sheldon, and Crampton Sheldon at the time allowed Ivanov to moonlight or do his own work on the side, because he was such a talented person in their office that they allowed him to do his own thing, which you wouldn't get away with today. But the houses that he was designing at the time, because he didn't have a client base or traction in the market, and he wasn't registered with the Institute, and he really didn't have a profile, a lot of the houses that were built were in the convention of what other people were doing, because that's what the clients wanted. So he had to design what his clients wanted instead of what he wanted to do to build up his client base. The Jordanov house is one of the earliest ones. It's very much in the Frank Lloyd Wright sort of style, with the brick walls and the ribbon windows. The inside of the Jordanov has got the signature colour that Lloyd Wright used to use, which was called Cherokee Red. And so this is typical of a Lloyd Wright influence, but what Iwanoff did was subtly put his own little take on the houses in some ways that he could, particularly on the design of the internal fit-outs and the furniture and the cabinets. Another house which is directly behind that Jordanov one is called the Lungi House, and John Lungi was an artist in Perth. And this one looks a little like a Swiss chalet influence, but it's typical of that 50s period with the stone fireplace and the skillion roof, and particularly with the wooden boarding on the outside. And it's got a very extensive landscaping around it, so that one is one of the better examples of his 50s period. Interestingly, during the mid to late 50s, Iwanoff was featured in House and Garden and Home Beautiful magazines, as well as the general newspapers at the time. But it was interesting that he actually had 7 features in these magazines, which outdid quite a lot of other architects of that period. And so that was quite an interesting discovery. During the 1950s, Iwanoff was actually employed by Griffiths and Simpson, which was a division of Young and Freeman architects here in Melbourne, and he actually designed 2 houses, one in Beaumaris, which is the Gibson House, which unfortunately was demolished, I think, about 2005, and there's another house in Spotswood, which still exists, and I was fortunate enough to have visited the house a couple of months ago, and the original owner, whose name is Miltonoff, one of the original owners, is still in that house over in Spotswood. Again, we're looking at some of the houses during that early 60s period. Again, you can see the strong 50s influence. This is a house in Dalkeith, which unfortunately was demolished in 2018, but it's typical of that 50s style. This again, 1959, Toshkov. Interestingly again, Toshkov was an engineer, and Toshkov actually studied with Iwanoff over in Munich. So there's a lot of social connections between some of the owners of the houses and Iwanoff. Again, you can see the flat roof and the typical stonework of the house. It's interesting that the 1950s houses that Iwanoff did were very much trying to suit the landscape of the site and to incorporate and bury them into the site to minimise their impact. But as he went on into his more blockwork style later on, the houses become more prominent on the site, so he went in a totally different direction on his approach. This is a 1959 house in Floreat. This one here was built for the German embassy, and this is one of his more elaborate examples with this sweeping roof line, the window treatments. Inside it's got quite a soaring ceiling that's all fully Jarrah and Wandoo wood, and that was one of the characteristics of the houses at the time in terms of the fit out, and also the elaborate parquet floors that they used to use in that period as well. The Schmidt-Lederman actually has got a unique type of feature. It's got 237 Jarrah pieces on its balcony, and all of these pieces pivot on a stainless steel rod, so they all can pivot in the wind and they can be closed or opened. So that's quite a unique feature on this particular house. It would be very difficult to maintain that sort of thing as well over time. Again, another typical 50s butterfly roof house with a front courtyard in Dalkeith in Perth. Got quite an exceptional landscaping of this house as well. And this is the Paganin house. This is 1967. This is where he was departing from the 50s and transitioning into the 1960s. And this house was featured on ABC Restoration Australia in 2018. This house was unfortunately burnt down, and the owners went to the effort of actually totally reconstructing it to its original specifications. So it's almost 95% original to the authentic to the original design. The owners of this even went to the extent of going to Italy and sourcing the marble that was actually used on the front of those balcony pieces and also internally on the front veranda. So they really went to a huge level of effort to actually recreate the original house in terms of all of the Jarrah fit out as well, with all of the ceilings and window frames. So that's an exceptional example of his works. And interestingly, if you look at the front of the house with the front ellipse or half curve, as I call it, that is one of Iwanoff's signature motifs, and it's something I'll talk about shortly. What happened in about 66, 67, Iwanoff started designing rectilinear houses which were elevated off the blocks and normally built on the highest point of the block with a very formal entry to the front of the houses, and that started a trend from 67 to 76 of a whole series of rectilinear houses in that similar sort of style with the Besser block concrete treatment on the front. This is another example of a 1960s house that you wouldn't necessarily recognise as an Iwanoff, but it does have the textile, they call it textile block on the front, and the stonework. Again, another typical 50s house going into the 1960s. This is 1964. This is the interior of that house. Unfortunately, this house got demolished in 2017, and they built a new house in its place. But the original house was quite impressive in terms of its fit out and its aesthetics. Again, another house from the 60s, a booth house, and again, it's a typical design from the 1950s and 60s period with the flat roof and the ribbon windows. Interestingly, Frank Lloyd Wright used textile blocks going back into the 1920s in California, and the textile blocks were basically patterned and perforated. And it was really, he used blockwork in terms of a one-dimensional application as a cladding on the outside of the houses. But it does rain in California, and over the decades what happened is that a lot of these houses that he built, the water percolated through the blocks and all went down into the base of the house and got concrete cancer and rotted all the houses out. So that was the downside of using perforated textile blocks. But what Iwanoff did is he took the blockwork concept and he actually extended it into a three-dimensional layering. So he took blockwork and the humble materials of concrete and basically used that as a sculptural element, but he took it to another extent than what Wright did. The Roberts House from 67 is the first example of where the Besser block application was done. Originally this house was not painted, it would have been the grey Besser blocks, but this is the first example of where Iwanoff was starting to utilise the three-dimensional geometric design of Besser block work. The Kessel House, this one is another fairly good example of his blockwork design, and it's very interesting that because Iwanoff had a background in engineering, he basically was stretching the technical capability of a Besser block, a concrete block. So what he was doing was he was cantilevering and suspending blocks and also creating these three-dimensional layers. And the way that it was achieved is that he used to cut the blocks and interlock them. He also used steel rods and he also used custom fittings brackets. So what he would do is he would basically bolt all of these facades together and then fill all the gaps up with mortar. So when you looked at the house from the front, you can't tell how it was actually put together. It's a very clever way of engineering the design, which is in addition to the aesthetic side of the approach. This again, the Featherby, is another example of the Besser blocks. From 1967 to 1976, Iwanoff designed 19 houses with the blockwork on it, and that's what he's mostly renowned for. But if you have a more closer look at his houses, even with the blockwork designs, you can see that there's a lot of very formal classical elements here in terms of the columns and the proportions and the symmetry of what he was doing. So he was not as radical as people think he was in terms of this blockwork approach. He was very much, there was a lot of duality in his work. There's a very strong formal and classical element to his work, as well as trying to do something a little bit different in terms of the geometric blockwork approach. Sergio Masala, I was fortunate enough to meet this fellow who built the Masala House, which is one of the most famous or infamous houses that Iwanoff did. There's actually a good photograph of it behind you there on the wall. And I was fortunate to have interviewed with Sergio in order to find out what the philosophy was behind the design of that house. When Iwanoff met Sergio, he suggested that Sergio was going on an overseas trip to America. So Ivan suggested that he go and have a look at a couple of different projects. And one of the projects was this church in San Francisco from 1968. And you can see that it's got these incredible sculptural curves on the roof line and the features. And this was done by Piero Luigi Nervi, who was a very famous Italian engineer. And this was the inspiration for the Marsala house. And you can see the sweeping roof line of that church was incorporated into the roof line of this house. The original design of the Marsala house is quite different to what was actually built, and it's got a much more elaborate blockwork detailing on the front, and it also didn't have the central stairway which was eventually built. A house that was built in 1974, and this was basically the culmination of Iwanoff's middle period or the Besser block period, and this house was originally going to be twice as large as that, but the owner balked and said, no, it's a bit too costly, too much. But you can see the scale of this in relation to all of those other houses next door. And when this house was built in 1974, all of that area was bushland in Perth. There was nothing around it. So this house would have been pretty prominent and pretty radical for its time. The front stairwell of that house is very classical. It's almost like a temple type approach. But I think by 1974 to 76, Iwanoff had taken the Besser block approach to its logical extreme. You know, he'd done a whole series of houses, but with this one, it was a sort of topping it off. He couldn't really go any further with this sort of approach. So he then entered in the last 10 years of his career, he was entering into a different approach. And the Tomic House, which is in City Beach, gives you an indication of where he was going. And Iwanoff was very much influenced by the Italian sculptural school of design, and particularly with Piero Luigi Nervi, who was an engineer, did a lot of very large stadiums and commercial buildings with very sweeping curved roofs. And also he was influenced by Carlo Scarpa and Giuseppe Tarangi. So the Italian school of sculptural design was more about the curves of the walls and blades and the use of different materials of marble and terrazzo and all sorts of the mixing of stone and brick and concrete together. And so Iwanoff was looking for as an artist, you're always looking at progressing. So he was then going in a totally different direction in the last 10 years of his life. Unfortunately, Iwanoff contracted cancer, so it sort of compromised his last 10 years of design, and his output diminished. But you could see that if circumstances were different, he would have ended up going in a totally different direction. Some of the projects he did later on, this was for Robert Holmes à Court, who was an entrepreneur in Perth. He was looking at doing an art gallery for his company. Unfortunately, this didn't get built, but you can see he's going for the very large sweeping statements on the roof line. This was a shopping complex in Switzerland. Again, he was looking at making a huge statement, similar to Luigi Nervi's design for commercial buildings with the sweeping roof lines. But again, this was just a proposal. It was never actually constructed. One of the things that I was looking at was what were the influences in Iwanoff's design. Growing up in Bulgaria, I think there was a subtle influence of Islamic design, because in Bulgaria, I think, according to Wikipedia, there's 1,260 mosques in Bulgaria. And the country was occupied by the Ottoman Empire for 500 years. So there's a very strong Islamic influence in a lot of the churches and buildings in Bulgaria. And one of the characteristics of the church is the ellipse or half curve. And I made a sort of connection here when I was looking at a lot of Iwanoff's works, that this may have been a very subtle influence, because that ellipse or half curve is one of his signature motifs that you can see right through a lot of his houses and also a lot of his custom furniture. It's just a theory that I have. One of the other influences of Islamic design is the complexity of layering of pattern work, and this is an example of a ceiling, and also when you look at Bulgarian folk art, even though initially it might look very simplistic, when you start looking at what they're doing, each of those little sections has very subtle differences in the geometric designs. So they're actually quite sophisticated. I just would suggest that perhaps some of this as a cultural influence from Bulgaria is being reflected in some of the external Besa block, the geometric designs on the Besa block work on the houses. And in terms of the principle of the complexity and the layering, not necessarily copying those particular patterns. This is the Galensa house, which is in Cottesloe in Perth. This house is about 100 metres from the beach, and it was designed for Peter Galensa, who was an artist, and Peter has got a studio in the front there, and he's overlooking Cottesloe Beach, so it's quite a unique position. This is the side of the house, and this gives you an indication of some of the geometric blockwork that Ivanov was doing. When he was designing these facades, Ivanov would number every block, and when they built the houses, he would go out on site with the bricklayers and the contractors, and he would work with them, pushing the blocks in and out on the walls and experimenting, because the differences in the projection of the blocks would create different shadows and contrasts. So he was very hands-on when he did all of this external work. This is another picture of the Galensa, and you can see how he has suspended brickwork across the top of the house, and that's very difficult to do from an engineering perspective, to suspend in mid-air using those various techniques. This is another example of the Tomic house, showing some of the geometric work on the back. One of the aspects I noticed that Ivanov was utilising inside his house was he was using levels and the use of temporary partitions and furniture to create spaces. And the principle of this painting by Theo van Donsberg in 1922 was to look at the idea of movement through a building or creating spaces without doors and walls. So you're using levels and using temporary partitions and other devices like furniture or cabinets without actually using walls. And Ivanov was renowned for not having walls on his rooms, and some of the owners complained because they didn't have privacy in the bedrooms, and he also created temporary partitions in the house as well to create spaces. But I can see that there was an influence from this particular painting in particular, and there was an architect, a Dutch architect called Gerrit Rietveld, and Gerrit Rietveld translated that concept of this painting into an actual house called the Schroeder House in 1924. So he designed this house reflecting those principles and getting movement through the house, through the various level changes, but without necessarily having wall partitions in the house, which is quite innovative at the time. And Ivanov did the same approach with his houses. In a lot of the houses, you can enter into the front door and you can actually see straight through to the back of the house through all the various layers of the rooms. This is a chair that was designed by Gerrit Rietveld, very radical for its time, using a combination of colours and planes. This is just an example of how Ivanov was using these principles. He was floating the cabinets on the bottom and from the top of the walls, from the ceilings. So he'd float cabinets and use them as a temporary partition, and he would have framing with gaps between the walls to create views out of each side. This is an interesting one. This is the Schenberg house. He's basically cutting holes in the walls and opening up the house. And with this particular house, the little section just through this frame is the kitchen, a linear kitchen, but you can actually look through 4 different rooms right out into the outside of the house at the back. Again, this showing how you open up the spaces and framing of the spaces within the house. This is an example just of some of Ivanov's custom fit-out with the furniture on one of the examples. The modernist movement prides itself on this division between the outside and inside of a house. and they've basically rebadged it and called it all sorts of names, but the principle is actually from Japan, which goes back millennia, and it's called intermediate space, where you're dissolving the division between the outside and the inside of the house. And this is a rare internal courtyard example of one of the houses. And so Iwanoff was applying this approach, which is very much the California modernism of utilising the inside, opening up the inside and the outside of the house because of the climatic conditions. As I said, that's the signature half curve or ellipse is basically reflected in a lot of the internal fit outs of the panel work of the houses and also the custom furniture. And so you can see that consistently right throughout all of his works. Again, you can see this is done, the ellipse is done in a vertical form, and this is an example from the Paganini house. These are actually a very thin, I'm trying to think of the material, the stonework, a very thin stonework that's translucent, and those are two sliding doors. But you can see that consistent approach to the design. And he also did curved roofs. If you look at this photograph, you can just see that he did curved roofs as well, ceilings, and he used acrylic plastic as translucent lighting in the top of the rooms as well. This is just an example of some of his commercial buildings. This one was from 1959, a hotel which was built in Bentley in Perth. Unfortunately, that was demolished probably back in the 1980s, but that shows a typical 1950s, 40s, 50s design that you wouldn't typically recognise as an Iwanoff. This is another theatre that was built here. It was designed for Nedlands in Perth. Again, it's a very typical 1950s style. While he was working, while Iwanoff was working in Melbourne, for Juncan Freeman, he was also involved with two projects. One was the law courts in Civic in Canberra. I think most of it was the internal fit out of the buildings, and another building was the New Zealand consulate. So when I was doing my research and I came here to Melbourne, I went through the Juncan Freeman archives, and we did identify that these were two projects that he was actually involved with. This was actually an interesting one. It's a factory in Perth. Unfortunately, it's now empty and it's likely to be demolished and redeveloped, but just a very interesting way to use the textile bricks on the front, and that little section at the front there is actually like a studio showroom, and it was originally a building that was used for a building contractor, and then it was taken over and used by a photographer as a studio. So hopefully that building may or may not be retained going forwards. This is actually a music recording studio in North Fremantle in Perth. I was fortunate enough to have got this listed on the council's municipal inventory in 2021. The owners were going to sell it, and so I lobbied the council to actually get it listed, and we did a compromise where it's a sort of a middle tier listing, but at least it's recognised as a historical building. The building was recently purchased by a couple, and they're now renovating it, and they're going to transform it into a residence. So that's interesting, and they're going to now reinstate and restore this building back to what it was on the front, because it had some minor brickwork detailing. Martin Clark was actually a recordings engineer in Perth, and he recorded Johnny Young, who was a pop star back in the 60s, and recorded quite a few other musicians, and he had state-of-the-art equipment, so he was a well-renowned Australian music engineer. This is the Northern Library, which was done in 1972. The interesting thing about this is that the building on the left is the library, and it's got curved walls on the sides and the front, so none of the walls are actually straight. They built that first, and then they built the second building, which was the council building, but at that time, back in the 1970s, by the time they came to build the council offices, there was a recession in WA, and they didn't have enough money to build it according to the original design. So I managed to find out that the building was actually meant to be 3 times as large. So it would have been, if I just go back, it would have been 3 times that size. So that would have been a major statement as a building. But the original building actually had a completely different facade on the front. It was meant to have that sort of elaborate geometric blockwork, but they ended up just having the vertical columns. This is an example of his curving roofs and the lighting treatment, and that was in the northern office. But he also incorporated this into 2 of the houses. One of the aspects we did as part of the research is Iwanoff designed 102 houses in total. I've managed to find there were 51 houses built out of the 102 that I can confirm, and there was a whole group of houses that were design proposals, and I got a graduate architect to actually digitise 19 of these houses, so they're going to be in the book. And so we've got a whole record of some of the houses that Iwanoff didn't build, including a lot of the Besser block examples. That's the conclusion of the talk. In terms of where we go from here, we've got a book coming out hopefully in a couple of months. But we are looking at doing some 3D modelling of some of Iwanoff's work, either a fly-throughs or physical models. So we're working on that as a project. And there's hopefully going to be a lot more work on other emigre architects in Perth, which have been never documented. And it's the same scenario here in Melbourne. There's a whole cohort of emigres that haven't been recognised or documented, so that's the next project, and there may well be another book that comes out of that particular exercise. So that's the end. Thank you.
On behalf of ACAARCH, thank you again, Warren. There are some forms for Warren's upcoming book, should you be interested in pre-purchasing. We'll also put more information on the ACAARCH website when it becomes available. And hopefully we'll be hosting a book launch sometime around August in the Japanese room upstairs, pending publishing deadlines,
yes,
and so on and so forth.
Okay.
So anyway, again, thank you.
No worries.